the taste of truth. The transport truck shuddered to a halt in the Wisconsin snow, its engine coughing one final protest against the bitter February cold. Through the frost-covered windows of Camp McCoy, Sergeant Takeshi Yamamoto could see dairy farms stretching endlessly under a grey sky, their red barns standing like monuments to an abundance he had never imagined possible. The church bells from the distant town of Sparta echoed across the frozen fields, mixing with the sound of wind through pine forests that reminded him painfully of home. 37 other Japanese prisoners sat in silence behind him, their breath creating small clouds in the unheated vehicle. None of them had expected this. Rolling farmland where cows stood fat in heated barns, so different from the tropical hellscape of Guadalcanal where they had been captured 4 months earlier. Yamamoto clutched the small photograph in his pocket, his wife Keiko and 6-year-old son Hiroshi standing beside their house in Osaka, and wondered what they would think of this strange, prosperous place where he would spend what remained of the war. The guards who opened the truck doors wore thick wool coats and moved with the casual efficiency of men who had never known real hunger. Corporal Billy Morrison, barely 19 and still carrying the soft features of a Wisconsin farm boy, gestured for them to form a line. His breath steamed in the cold air as he spoke in careful, rehearsed Japanese. "Welcome to Camp McCoy. You will be treated according to Geneva Convention." Lieutenant Sato, who had been Yamamoto's superior before their capture, whispered harshly in Japanese, "Geneva Convention," as if international law means anything to barbarians. "They want us to believe we're guests, not prisoners." But as they were led through the camp gates, Yamamoto noticed something that made his propaganda-trained mind struggle. The guards weren't celebrating their capture or displaying trophies of war. Instead, they looked tired, almost bored, as if processing enemy prisoners was just another duty in a long, cold winter. The barracks were wooden but solid, with glass windows and metal chimney pipes suggesting actual heat. This wasn't the concentration camp of starvation and torture he had been told to expect if captured alive. The first real shock came at dinner. The mess hall at Camp McCoy smelled of roasted meat and fresh bread, scents so rich they made Yamamoto's empty stomach clench with desperate hunger. Instead of the thin gruel they had received on the transport ships, the servers ladled thick beef stew into metal bowls, added thick slices of white bread still warm from the oven, and poured glasses of fresh milk that was creamier than anything he had tasted even before the war. Yamamoto stared at his plate, remembering the careful rationing his family had endured for the past 3 years. Rice had become precious, meat almost non-existent. His last letter from Keiko had mentioned eating sweet potato leaves to fill their stomachs, while little Hiroshi had grown thin despite her best efforts. And here, in an enemy prison camp, he was being served more food than most Japanese civilians saw in a week. Across the table, Lieutenant Sato pushed his untouched bowl away. "It's a trap," he whispered in Japanese. "They want us soft, compliant. A true soldier does not accept luxuries from the enemy. Remember your duty. If we survive this war and return home, what will we tell our families? That we grew fat while they starved." But Yamamoto was hungry, bone-deep hungry, in a way that made his hands shake. He had lost 30 pounds since his capture, and his uniform hung loose on his frame. Slowly, almost reverently, he lifted the spoon to his mouth and tasted the stew. Salt and fat exploded on his tongue, beef so tender it fell apart, vegetables cooked until they melted. Warmth spread through his chest for the first time in months, and for a moment he forgot everything except the simple miracle of having enough to eat. The guilt came afterward, heavy and persistent as the Wisconsin snow that continued falling outside the mess hall windows. As he walked back to the barracks, his stomach finally full, Yamamoto caught sight of his reflection in a window. His face looked different. Not just thinner from months of near starvation, but somehow softer. The hard certainty he had carried since training camp in Kyoto had developed cracks, small fissures that let in unwelcome questions. That night, lying on a narrow but clean bunk with an actual wool blanket, he pulled out Keiko's photograph and studied it by moonlight. In the picture, she was smiling, but he could see the strain around her eyes, the way her kimono hung looser than it should have. What would she think if she knew he had just eaten better than she had in years? What would she think if she knew that their enemies, the Americans he had been taught to hate as weak and decadent, could afford to feed their prisoners like honored guests? The questions multiplied in the darkness, each one undermining another piece of the certainty he had carried into war. If America was truly the starving, desperate nation his officers had described, how could they spare such abundance for enemy soldiers? If Americans were the cruel barbarians of propaganda films, why did the guards look at them with something that seemed almost like pity rather than hatred? Outside, the Wisconsin wind howled through the pine trees, carrying the scent of wood smoke from the guards' quarters. Somewhere in the distance, a radio played American music, big band jazz, that sounded nothing like the martial songs of his homeland. The melody was complex, improvised, full of unexpected harmony that spoke of a culture with room for beauty even in wartime. Yamamoto closed his eyes and tried to remember the taste of rice, the simple comfort of miso soup, the way green tea warmed his throat on cold mornings in Osaka. But what lingered instead was the memory of that beef stew, rich and abundant, prepared by people who had been taught to hate him, but had chosen instead to feed him. If stories like this make you question what you'd do in someone else's boots, tell us in the comments how you imagine you'd react in this camp, and stay with us for the next chapters. Winter deepened over Camp McCoy, but inside the heated barracks, the prisoners began to establish routines that felt almost normal. Each morning at 600, Corporal Morrison would appear with work assignments, his breath steaming in the cold air as he read from a clipboard in careful English. The prisoners were assigned to maintenance details, clearing snow from pathways, helping with laundry, repairing camp buildings, work that seemed designed more to occupy their time than to exploit their labor. Yamamoto found himself working alongside Morrison most days, their conversations limited to basic English phrases and hand gestures. The young guard carried family photographs in his worn leather wallet, and sometimes, during their 10-minute breaks, he would show them without thinking. His parents standing beside a red barn identical to dozens Yamamoto could see from the camp. His sister Margaret in her high school graduation dress, his older brother Thomas in his navy dress blues. "Brother," Morrison would say, pointing to the uniformed figure. "Pacific." His voice carried a weight that needed no translation. Doctor. Elizabeth Chen, the camp's medical officer, had been watching the prisoners with growing concern. The daughter of Chinese immigrants who had settled in San Francisco, she understood something about being caught between worlds, about carrying loyalty to a place while building life in another. During her weekly examinations, she noticed that several prisoners were suffering from severe vitamin deficiencies and the lingering effects of prolonged malnutrition. She approached Camp Commander Colonel Harrison with a request that seemed absurd even to her: permission to provide the prisoners with fresh vegetables, citrus fruit, and vitamin supplements that might restore their health. Harrison, a practical man from Minnesota who worried about inspection reports from Washington, studied the medical reports and reluctantly agreed. "Doctor, I trust your judgment," he said. "But remember, these are enemy soldiers, not patients in a civilian hospital." "Yes, sir," Dr. Chen replied quietly. "But they're also human beings under our care." On a surprisingly warm afternoon in early March, Morrison appeared in the work shed, carrying a wooden crate that made a distinctive clinking sound. The prisoners looked up from their repair work, fixing broken chairs and tables from the mess hall, as he set the box down with unusual ceremony. "Special ration," he announced in his careful, practiced Japanese, one of perhaps 20 phrases he had learned from Dr. Chen. Inside the crate were bottles of Coca-Cola, Still cold from the camp refrigerator, their distinctive green glass surfaces beaded with condensation that caught the afternoon light. Yamamoto had heard of Coca-Cola from propaganda broadcasts that mocked American decadence, the expensive sugar water that showed how frivolous and wasteful the enemy had become. But he had never seen an actual bottle, had never held the distinctively curved glass, or read the flowing script that seemed almost like art. Morrison opened his own bottle with a metal opener attached to his belt, the cap making a sharp pop as it came free. He took a long drink, then gestured for the prisoners to help themselves. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Yamamoto reached forward and selected a bottle, the glass cold and smooth against his palm. The first taste hit him like a revelation. Sweetness exploded across his tongue, not the gentle sweetness of fruit or rice wine, but something concentrated and almost overwhelming. Then came the carbonation, bubbles that seemed to dance and bite, creating sensations he had no words for in any language. The flavor was impossible to describe, complex and simple at the same time, artificial yet somehow satisfying in a way that made him understand why American soldiers might crave this strange drink. Around him, other prisoners experienced the same shock. Some laughed despite themselves, surprised by the intense bubbles. Others, like Lieutenant Sato, set their bottles down after a single sip, their faces tight with disapproval and something that looked like fear. That evening, as snow began falling again outside the barracks windows, Yamamoto lay on his bunk, holding the empty Coca-Cola bottle. The taste lingered in his mouth, sweet and strange, like a memory he couldn't quite place. He thought about the abundance implied by that single drink, sugar refined from distant fields, water purified and bottled, carbonation added for no reason except pleasure, then cooled and distributed to prisoners of war as if it were nothing special. In Japan, sugar had become a luxury reserved for the most important occasions. His last birthday before deployment, Keiko had managed to find enough to make a small cake for Hiroshi, and they had eaten it slowly, savoring each precious bite. Yet here, in an enemy prison camp, sugar water was given away to captured soldiers as a casual gesture. Lieutenant Sato appeared beside his bunk, his face grave in the dim light from the single bulb that illuminated their section of the barracks. "Sergeant," he said quietly, "I need to speak with you." They walked to the far end of the barracks, where their conversation wouldn't wake the sleeping prisoners. Through the windows, they could see the guards' quarters, where warm yellow light spilled from windows and the sound of laughter occasionally carried on the wind. "This afternoon," Sato said carefully, "I watched you drink their poison." "It's just a beverage, sir." "No." Sato's voice was intense, but controlled. "It's a weapon. They're trying to make us forget who we are, forget our duty, our emperor, our family's honor. When we return to Japan, when this war is over and we go home, what will you tell your wife? That you enjoyed enemy luxuries while she rationed rice? That you found pleasure in American sugar while Japanese children went hungry?" Yamamoto had no answer. He stared out at the snow-covered Wisconsin landscape, thinking about the photographs Morrison had shown him, American farms with barns full of grain, families that looked well-fed and content even in wartime. The cognitive dissonance was becoming unbearable. Everything he had been taught about America suggested a weak, desperate nation on the verge of collapse. Yet everything he witnessed suggested prosperity beyond imagination. "I don't know what I'll tell her," he said finally. "I don't know what any of this means anymore." March brought the first hints of spring to Camp McCoy, and with the warming weather came mail call, the weekly distribution of letters that had somehow made their way across an ocean and a continent to reach the prisoners. Yamamoto's name was called twice, one letter from Keiko and another from his mother in Kyoto. He opened Keiko's letter with trembling hands, aware that Lieutenant Sato was watching him from across the barracks. The letter was dated 2 months earlier, the thin rice paper covered with his wife's careful calligraphy. She wrote about the rationing that had grown even stricter, about how Hiroshi had started working in the neighborhood gardens to help with food production, about the bombing raids that had come closer to Osaka but had not yet reached their district. "We are managing well," she wrote, "though rice is now precious and meat is only a memory. Hiroshi asks about you every day and sends his love. The neighbors speak of you with pride. Captured while fighting bravely for the Emperor's glory, we pray for your honor and your return." The words hit him like physical blows. His wife was proud of his capture because she believed he had fought to the death and somehow survived. His son was working in gardens at age 6 because food was so scarce. They were managing on rations that would be considered starvation here at Camp McCoy, where he had eaten roast chicken the night before, accompanied by mashed potatoes and green beans that had been canned from the previous summer's harvest. His mother's letter was even more difficult to read. She described the increasing air raids on Kyoto, the way families were preparing for the final invasion of Japan, the absolute certainty that American forces would treat civilians with the same cruelty they showed prisoners of war. "If capture comes," she wrote, "we have prepared to die with honor rather than submit to enemy brutality." That afternoon, as he worked alongside Morrison repairing fence posts damaged by winter ice, Yamamoto found himself studying the young American's face. Morrison was humming a popular song under his breath, something about a girl named Peggy Sue, and occasionally he would share stories about his family's farm 30 miles south of the camp. His parents raised dairy cattle and grew corn, he explained in his limited Japanese, and before the war they had always had enough food, enough warmth, enough of everything that mattered for simple comfort. The cognitive dissonance was becoming unbearable. According to the letters from home, Americans were supposed to be desperate savages preparing to rape and murder their way across Japan. But Morrison was a farm boy who carried pictures of his high school sweetheart and worried about his parents' harvest. Dr. Chen treated the prisoners' ailments with the same care she showed American personnel. Even the camp guards, when they thought no one was looking, sometimes slipped extra food onto the prisoners' plates during mess hall duty. During the evening meal, the contradiction reached its breaking point. The kitchen staff served hamburgers, thick beef patties grilled to perfection and placed on soft, fresh buns, accompanied by fried potatoes and pickles. For men who had been raised on rice and fish, who had been taught that American food was crude and inferior, the meal was a revelation. The meat was rich and satisfying in ways that contradicted every piece of propaganda they had absorbed about their enemies. Yamamoto bit into his hamburger and found himself thinking about little Hiroshi, wondering if American children ate food like this every day, wondering if the country that could feed its prisoners so well might not be the weak, decadent society he had been trained to despise. The thought came unbidden, unwelcome, impossible to dismiss. Lieutenant Sato found him after dinner, walking alone near the fence line where the guard towers cast long shadows in the setting sun. The Wisconsin landscape stretched away toward distant farms, their lights beginning to twinkle as families gathered for their own evening meals. "You're forgetting who you are," Sato said without preamble. "I can see it in your face. In the way you eat their food, drink their poison, smile at their jokes. You're forgetting your duty, your emperor, your family's honor." "Maybe I'm just seeing clearly for the first time," Yamamoto replied, surprised by his own boldness. "Seeing what? Enemy propaganda designed to weaken our resolve? Seeing that maybe everything we were taught was wrong? Look around us. Does this look like a nation on the verge of collapse? Does Morrison seem like a bloodthirsty savage? When we return home, what will we tell them? That America was exactly what they said, or what we actually experienced?" Sato's face went pale in the twilight. "When we return home, we will tell them that we maintained our honor despite enemy attempts at corruption. We will tell them that we never forgot who we were, never betrayed our people, never accepted comfort from those who killed our brothers." But even as he spoke, his voice carried doubt. They had both seen too much, experienced too many small kindnesses, tasted too much abundance to maintain the simple certainties they had carried into war. That night, Yamamoto lay awake, listening to the sounds of rural Wisconsin, owls calling from pine woods, the distant whistle of freight trains carrying goods across a continent, the soft breathing of 37 other men who were wrestling with the same impossible questions. In his pocket, the empty Coca-Cola bottle from that first afternoon remained, a small token of the sweetness that had begun to dissolve everything he thought he knew about enemies and friends, about right and wrong, about the war itself. The taste lingered in his memory, complex and troubling, like the war that had brought him here, and the peace that would someday force him to choose between loyalty to what he had been taught and loyalty to what he had witnessed with his own eyes. Do you think you'd cling to what you were taught back home, or to what your own eyes see in a place like this? Comment which side you'd lean toward, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. April brought unexpected warmth to Camp McCoy, and with it came the sound of machinery as local farmers began preparing their fields for spring planting. The prisoners were assigned to new work details that took them beyond the camp's fence line for the first time since their arrival. Under guard supervision, they helped repair damage to nearby barns and silos that had suffered during the harsh Wisconsin winter. It was during one of these work details that Yamamoto first encountered Sarah Morrison, Corporal Morrison's 12-year-old sister. She appeared at the fence line of the Morrison family farm on a Tuesday morning, watching the prisoners work with the frank curiosity of childhood. Her blonde braids were tied with blue ribbons, and she carried a lunch pail that suggested she was on her way to the one-room schoolhouse that served the rural district. "Billy says you're from Japan," she said to Yamamoto through the fence, speaking slowly and clearly as if volume might bridge the language gap. "Is it true you've never seen snow before you came here?" Yamamoto paused in his work, replacing broken fence posts, and studied the girl's earnest face. In careful English, he replied, "Snow in Japan, but not like Wisconsin snow. Not so deep." Sarah's face lit up with delight. "You speak English. Billy said some of you were learning. Do you miss your home? Do you have children?" Before he could answer, Corporal Morrison appeared, his face flushed with embarrassment and concern. "Sarah, you know you're not supposed to—" "It's all right," Yamamoto said quickly. "She is curious child, natural." From his pocket he pulled out the photograph of Keiko and Hiroshi, now worn soft from constant handling. Sarah studied it solemnly, her young face serious with the weight of understanding that this enemy soldier was also a father missing his family. "Your little boy looks about the age of my cousin Tommy," she said. "Does he go to school?" "Yes, in Osaka, big city." Yamamoto struggled with the English, but Sarah waited patiently. He helps family now. War makes everyone work." Dr. Chen had been watching this exchange from where she was checking on prisoners for signs of heat exhaustion. The spring weather was warm after the long winter, and several men were struggling to adjust. She approached the fence with the careful movements of someone who understood she was witnessing something significant. "How are you feeling, Sergeant Yamamoto?" she asked in her calm professional voice. "Any dizziness or nausea from the heat?" "I am well, Dr. Chen, thank you." She studied his face with the practiced eye of someone trained to see beyond surface symptoms. "You've gained back some weight since winter. The vitamin supplements seem to be helping." It was true. The combination of abundant food and medical care had restored much of his physical health, but Yamamoto was beginning to understand that his recovery was creating complications he hadn't anticipated. The stronger he became, the more clearly he could think about the contradictions surrounding him. The better he felt, the more difficult it became to maintain the simple hatred that had sustained him through capture and the early months of imprisonment. That evening, Dr. Chen made an unusual appearance in the prisoners' barracks. She carried a small bag of medical supplies, but her real purpose seemed to be conversation. She sat on the wooden bench near the stove and spoke quietly to several prisoners about their health, their sleep patterns, their adjustment to the camp routine. When she reached Yamamoto, she paused longer than with the others. "You seem troubled lately," she said. "Not physically, emotionally. It's common among long-term prisoners. The mind struggles to process experiences that don't fit previous understanding." "Doctor," he said carefully, "may I ask question?" "Of course." "Why you treat us so well? Geneva Convention, yes, but more than required. Why?" Dr. Chen was quiet for a long moment, considering her answer. "My parents came to America from China 40 years ago," she said finally. "They were treated as enemies, as people who could never truly belong. But some Americans saw them as human beings first, Chinese second. Those small acts of recognition made all the difference in their lives, and in mine. You see us as human beings first? I see you as men far from home, caught in circumstances beyond your control, trying to maintain dignity while the world around them makes no sense. Yes, human beings first." After she left, Yamamoto found himself thinking about her words as he listened to the familiar night sounds of the Wisconsin countryside. Through the barracks windows, he could see lights in the farmhouses scattered across the valley, families gathering for their evening routines. Somewhere out there, Sarah Morrison was probably doing homework or helping her mother with dishes, carrying on the normal life of an American child who had shown more genuine interest in his welfare than many of his own countrymen had before the war. Lieutenant Sato appeared beside his bunk again, his face grave in the dim light. "The doctor's visit was not routine," he said quietly. "She was evaluating us for something, probably psychological weakness, signs that their propaganda is working. Or maybe she was just being kind." "Kindness from the enemy is the most dangerous weapon of all," Sato replied. "It makes us forget that they are the ones who bombed our cities, who killed our brothers, who will destroy our families if they win this war." But even as Sato spoke, his voice carried less certainty than before. The long months at Camp McCoy had worn down his rigid ideology, just as they had worn down everyone else's. The daily evidence of American abundance, the small acts of consideration from guards and medical staff, the simple reality of being treated as human beings rather than animals, it all accumulated into a weight that no amount of training could prepare them to carry. Outside, a freight train whistle echoed across the Wisconsin night, carrying goods and people across a continent that seemed impossibly vast and prosperous. Yamamoto closed his eyes and tried to imagine what he would tell Keiko and Hiroshi when the war ended and he returned home. How could he explain that their enemies had fed him better than his own army ever had cared for his health when he was sick, had allowed a 12-year-old girl to show him pictures and ask about his family? The questions had no easy answers, and he was beginning to understand that the hardest part of being a prisoner of war might not be the captivity itself, but the moment when the gates opened and he would have to decide what version of the truth he could bear to carry home. The secret arrived on a Tuesday morning in late May, carried in the leather satchel of a Red Cross inspector named Father Michael O'Brien. The Irish-American chaplain had been visiting POW camps across the Midwest, documenting conditions and ensuring compliance with international agreements, but his real mission was more complex than bureaucratic oversight. Father O'Brien had requested a private meeting with selected prisoners to discuss their treatment and any concerns they might wish to report. Yamamoto found himself chosen for this interview, along with Lieutenant Sato and 5 others. They met in the camp's small library, surrounded by books donated by churches and civic organizations across Wisconsin. Volumes that included everything from American novels to technical manuals, all available to prisoners who wished to improve their English. "I want you to understand," Father O'Brien began in careful Japanese, "that anything you tell me will be documented and reported to the appropriate authorities. My job is to ensure you are being treated according to international law, but also to listen if you have concerns about returning home after the war." Lieutenant Sato stiffened. "We have no concerns about returning home. We are loyal soldiers of the Emperor." "Of course," the chaplain replied gently. "But sometimes men in your situation worry about how their experiences will be understood by families and communities who haven't lived through the same circumstances." The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with most prisoners offering careful, formal responses about their adequate treatment and their eagerness to return to Japan. But as the meeting was ending, Father O'Brien pulled Yamamoto aside for a private word. "Son," he said quietly, "I've been visiting camps like this for 2 years now. I've talked to German prisoners, Italian prisoners, and now Japanese prisoners. I see something in your eyes that I recognize. The look of a man who's discovered that his enemies aren't what he expected them to be." Yamamoto said nothing, but the chaplain continued. "When this war ends, and it will end soon, you're going to face a choice that no one prepared you for. You can return home and tell people what you think they want to hear about American brutality and deprivation. Or you can tell them the truth about what you actually experienced. Both choices carry consequences you need to understand." "What consequences?" Father O'Brien reached into his satchel and pulled out a folder thick with documents. Reports from prisoners who've already been repatriated, letters from families. Some men who spoke honestly about their treatment in American camps were accused of collaboration, of betraying their country by accepting enemy kindness. Others who confirmed expected narratives about American cruelty found themselves living with lies that poisoned their relationships and their peace of mind. The chaplain opened the folder and showed Yamamoto a photograph that made his breath catch. Prisoners at another camp, somewhere in the American South, standing in formation for what appeared to be a celebration. They were holding bottles of Coca-Cola and wearing clean uniforms, their faces showing the same well-fed contentment that Yamamoto knew was visible in his own appearance. This picture was taken at Camp Shelby in Mississippi last Christmas. The prisoners were given a special meal, entertainment, and small gifts. When copies of this photograph reached Japan through prisoner mail, several families disowned their captured relatives, claiming they had brought shame on the family honor by appearing to enjoy their captivity. Yamamoto stared at the photograph, seeing himself and his fellow prisoners reflected in those distant faces. What should a man do? That's not for me to decide. But I can tell you this: the truth has a weight that lies don't carry. You can live with difficult truth, but lies eat away at a man's soul until there's nothing left but emptiness. That evening, as Yamamoto worked his regular detail in the camp kitchen, helping to prepare the evening meal, he found himself handling the familiar green bottles of Coca-Cola that had become such a powerful symbol of his complicated captivity. As he loaded them into metal tubs filled with ice, the cold glass felt different in his hands, weighted with the knowledge of what these simple drinks represented to people back home. Morrison appeared beside him, carrying a case of the bottles from the storage room. Over the months of working together, they had developed an easy friendship based on shared work and mutual respect, despite the language barriers and the fact that they were technically enemies. "Sergeant," Morrison said carefully, "I want to show you something, but I need to know you won't repeat it to the other prisoners." Yamamoto nodded, curious about the unusual seriousness in the young man's voice. Morrison reached into his wallet and pulled out a new photograph. Not the familiar family pictures he had shown before, but an official Navy telegram. Even without being able to read all the English, Yamamoto could understand its meaning. Morrison's brother Thomas had been killed when his destroyer was sunk near Saipan. No survivors found. "This came last week," Morrison said, his voice thick with grief he had been carrying alone. He was my best friend, you know. We grew up together, worked the farm together, planned to work it together after the war. Yamamoto felt the world shift around him as he understood what Morrison was telling him. This young man, who had shown him nothing but kindness for months, had just learned that Japanese forces, men who might have been Yamamoto's own comrades, had killed his beloved brother. Yet Morrison had continued to treat the prisoners with the same respect, had continued to share his family photographs, had continued to offer Coca-Cola and small gestures of friendship. "I'm sorry," Yamamoto said in English, the words feeling inadequate but necessary. "Very sorry for your brother." Morrison nodded, tears visible in his eyes. "I know it wasn't you personally, but your people, they killed him. And I keep thinking I should hate you for it, should treat you different, but I can't. You remind me of him somehow. The way you care about your family, the way you work hard, the way you try to do right even when everything's confused." They stood together in the camp kitchen, surrounded by the abundance that had become such a source of moral confusion for Yamamoto. Cases of soft drinks, sides of beef hanging in the cold storage, bags of sugar and flour that represented more wealth than most Japanese families saw in a year. Two soldiers on opposite sides of a terrible war, sharing grief that transcended nationality and propaganda. That night, Yamamoto lay on his bunk, holding one of the empty Coca-Cola bottles that had become his talisman of cognitive dissonance. The sweet taste was still there in his memory, but now it carried additional weight. The knowledge that this simple pleasure was being documented, reported, potentially used as evidence of his corruption by enemy propaganda. Lieutenant Sato approached his bunk for what Yamamoto somehow knew would be their final conversation about loyalty and duty. "I know what the chaplain told you," Sato said quietly. "I know about the photographs, the reports, the consequences waiting for us at home. But I also know what's right, what honor demands. When we return to Japan, we must tell our families and our emperor that we never forgot who we were, never accepted comfort from those who destroyed our cities. Even if it's not true, especially if it's not true. Sometimes loyalty requires carrying lies that protect people from truths they couldn't bear." Yamamoto understood that Lieutenant Sato was choosing his version of integrity, the kind that prioritized family honor over personal honesty, that accepted the burden of living with falsehood in order to preserve social harmony. It was a choice that deserved respect, even if Yamamoto was beginning to realize he couldn't make the same choice himself. Outside the barracks windows, the Wisconsin night was warm with approaching summer, and somewhere in the distance, a radio was playing jazz music that spoke of a complex, prosperous civilization far removed from the propaganda descriptions of American barbarism. The war was ending. Everyone could feel it in the changing tone of news reports, in the relaxed attitude of the guards, in the way discussions had begun about repatriation procedures. Soon, very soon, Yamamoto would have to decide what version of the truth he could bear to carry home. The news of Japan's surrender reached Camp McCoy on a humid August morning, crackling through radio speakers that had been set up in the mess hall for the announcement. Yamamoto stood with the other prisoners, listening to President Truman's voice describe the end of the Pacific War, while around them, American guards maintained respectful silence. Some prisoners wept openly. Others sat in stunned silence, trying to process the reality that their emperor, the living God they had been raised to worship, had surrendered unconditionally to the enemies who had been feeding them hamburgers and Coca-Cola for the past 18 months. Lieutenant Sato retreated to his bunk and refused to speak for 3 days, staring at the ceiling with eyes that seemed to see nothing. But for Yamamoto, the moment of true reckoning came 2 weeks later, when Morrison appeared in the workshop carrying a Kodak camera and asking through Dr. Chen's translation if any prisoners would like to send photographs home to their families. The idea seemed impossible, that American guards would help enemy soldiers communicate with loved ones, that such a gesture could exist in the space between war and peace. "The Red Cross arranged it," Morrison explained. They figure families back home are worried, want to know you're alive and well. You can write a short letter too if you want." Yamamoto agreed to pose for the photograph, but insisted on doing it beside the camp garden where he had worked throughout the summer. He had helped plant tomatoes, corn and beans in the rich Wisconsin soil, had learned American farming techniques that produced yields he had never imagined possible. In the photograph, he held a large tomato he had grown himself, his face showing a complexity that would have been unthinkable when he first arrived. Relief, confusion, gratitude, and a kind of exhausted wisdom. When the pictures were developed a week later, Morrison gave him extra copies, enough to send to different relatives, as if understanding that some stories needed to be shared widely to be believed. "What will you tell them?" Morrison asked as they looked at the photographs together. "About the camp, about us, about everything that happened here." Yamamoto studied his own face in the picture, seeing a man who had been changed by experiences that defied easy explanation. "I don't know yet. Maybe the truth. Maybe what they need to hear. Maybe something in between." The first twist came with the repatriation orders. Instead of being shipped home immediately, the prisoners would remain at Camp McCoy for several more months while military authorities processed paperwork and arranged transportation. During this liminal period, something unexpected happened. The rigid structure of prisoner-guard relationships began to dissolve into something more human and complicated. Morrison brought his sister Sarah to visit the camp officially, introducing her to Yamamoto as the Japanese sergeant who helped fix our barn fence. Sarah, now 13 and more serious than the curious child who had approached the fence line the year before, presented Yamamoto with a carefully wrapped package. Inside was a hand-knitted scarf in blue and grey wool, along with a letter written in careful script. "For your little boy in Japan. My mother helped me make it. We hope your family is safe and that you can go home soon." The gift broke something in Yamamoto's heart that had been carefully held together for months. He wept openly, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming recognition that the American farm girl had spent hours knitting wool for a Japanese child she would never meet, simply because she understood that fathers missed their sons regardless of which flag they served under. The second twist came in November, when Father O'Brien returned to the camp with news that changed everything. Japan was not the devastated wasteland the prisoners had imagined. While cities had been bombed and the population was struggling, the social structure remained largely intact. More importantly, the occupation authorities were actively encouraging former prisoners to speak honestly about their treatment in American camps, as part of a broader effort to demonstrate American values to the Japanese people. "The narrative has changed," the chaplain explained. "You won't be returning to a society that expects tales of American brutality. You'll be returning to a society that needs to understand how former enemies can become friends." But the most profound twist came on a December evening, 3 days before the first group of prisoners was scheduled to depart for San Francisco and the transport ships that would carry them home. Dr. Chen appeared in the barracks carrying a wooden crate that made a familiar clinking sound. "One last toast," she said, setting down bottles of Coca-Cola for each prisoner. "To going home, and to remembering that enemies can choose to see each other as human." As Yamamoto held the cold glass bottle, he thought about the journey that had brought him from that first shocked taste 18 months earlier to this moment of conscious choice. The sweetness was the same, but everything else had changed. He was no longer the man who had been captured at Guadalcanal, certain of his righteousness and his enemy's evil. He was someone new, someone who carried uncomfortable knowledge about the complexity of war and the possibility of mercy between enemies. Lieutenant Sato surprised everyone by joining the toast. "To survival," he said quietly, "and to the stories we choose to carry home." The ship that carried them across the Pacific in January 1946 was an American transport vessel, but the prisoners were treated as repatriating soldiers rather than defeated enemies. They were given clean uniforms, adequate food, and medical care. Most importantly, they were given time to prepare for the questions they would face when they returned to families and communities that had been preparing for invasion and devastation. Yamamoto spent the long voyage writing letters to Keiko, trying to explain experiences that seemed impossible to communicate. How could he describe the abundance of Camp McCoy to people who had survived on rations? How could he explain the kindness of guards to people who expected tales of torture? How could he convey the moral complexity of accepting comfort from enemies without betraying his loyalty to family and country? In the end, he decided to tell the truth simply and let others draw their own conclusions. He wrote about the Wisconsin winter, about learning to grow tomatoes in American soil, about a farm girl who knitted scarves for enemy children, about a guard who shared photographs of his dead brother. He wrote about hamburgers and Coca-Cola, about the terrible confusion of being treated with dignity by people he had been taught to hate. Years later, back in Osaka with his family, Yamamoto kept those photographs from Camp McCoy on his kitchen table. When his grandchildren asked about the war, he would show them the images, the American camp, the Wisconsin farmland, the young guard who had become something like a friend. He would tell them about the taste of Coca-Cola, sweet and strange and impossibly complicated, like the memory of a war that had ended not with conquest or defeat, but with the quiet realization that enemies could choose, in small but crucial moments, to see each other as human. The bottles of Coca-Cola became a family tradition. Every year, on the anniversary of his return from America, Yamamoto would buy a case of the familiar green bottles and share them with his children and grandchildren, telling them the story of how a simple soft drink had taught him that the hardest lesson of war was learning to carry kindness rather than hatred across the years. The taste remained in his memory forever. Sweet and carbonated and full of contradictions, like the truth that mercy could exist even in the darkest times, and that small acts of recognition between enemies might be the most important victories of all. If this story reminded you that even in the darkest times, small acts of humanity still matter, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.